It's been a journey for me. I'd say when I first started interacting with entrepreneurs, so founders, about 10 years ago, I immediately felt like I'd found my people. And the reason I was first attracted to working with Aurora in the very early days when we spun the company up was because of actually my own personal family history. So my grandfather had got dementia when I was about 12. And I'm sure, almost everybody has experience of what that's like. It's watching somebody disappear who's a big part of your life. My grandfather. We were talking about grandfathers earlier, weren't we, Jay? Then as we've got into this journey, we pivoted the company into the women's health arena, and this entire curtain was pulled back for me around how much of our foundational structure of research, everything that's gone before, up until 30 years ago, there weren't any women in any clinical trials or research, pretty much. And so there are just massive gaps that we take for granted of what's normal in terms of how we're served. And I think it's not just a disservice to women. It's like we've been staring at one model for many, many years, and now we expect to get more insights, whereas I firmly believe that, now that we're actually starting to look at women and the complexity that in particular, the kind of hormonal cycle that we experience and how that changes our brain and everything else that goes on in our body and how we age, I genuinely believe it's a win-win for everybody. We're actually going to have insights that are going to drive better healthcare, better solutions for everyone.
So we in an earlier session today, we were talking about dementia more broadly. And one of the things we were talking about was the fact that sex is a determinant, potentially, of whether you are at risk, and especially the fact that more women than men will develop Alzheimer's, for example. So it's about 2/3 of Alzheimer's, people with Alzheimer's are women. And it's not just because they're living longer, right? There's other factors. And some of that has driven what you're doing as well. But your particular solution is focused on polycystic ovarian syndrome. And I wonder if you can just maybe say a little bit about what that is and how the heck does that relate to dementia?
Yeah, of course. So PCOS, I'm sure many people in this room have never even heard of this condition. So when I tell you that it affects 1 in 5 individuals assigned female at birth, you can look around, and although many people take many years to get diagnosed or don't get diagnosed, it's actually incredibly common. And PCOS is really the eye of the storm in hormonal, metabolic, menstrual, reproductive health. We're talking about a condition where at its core, women produce too much androgens, male sex hormones. And so traditionally, PCOS is seen as a reproductive disorder. It's the #1 cause of female infertility. That's horrendous, right? I've been through the infertility journey for almost 8 or 10 years. I know how bad that can be. But that completely overlooks its impact on women across their lifespan. And so it increases the risk of almost all major killers of women. Yes, it increases the risk of pregnancy complications, postpartum complications, but it also increases the risk of dementia by 2 times. And so for me, we're very excited at the potential of really going deep and looking at this community of women who have this increased risk of diabetes, dementia, cardiovascular disease, because they will give us a window into how we can have these modifiable factors and maybe what's most effective based on more individualized profiles. So, similar to your work, trying to get it from just general advice, go for a jog, to actually more specific advice based on your makeup, how your body works more precisely.
She mentioned your work. Why don't you enlighten all of us here about what you do?
Sure. So I do brain research mostly, which has become more and more applied to the people whose brains I'm studying as I've grown in the research world. One thing I look at is healthy aging. So what things you can do to keep your mind healthy into late-aged adulthood, and how your brain supports those processes, and then how we can help your brain support those processes. So what can you do from a brain perspective in the real world to live I love your phrasing from before, so that live with dignity.
A life of purpose, fulfillment, and dignity.
Exactly. I also look at what happens when in the context of disease. So I look specifically at depression and try and figure out how and why individuals who don't respond to depression treatment can be made to respond from a brain perspective.
And can I ask, because I'll come back to why I'm asking this question in a moment, but for both of you, to your last point, this idea of personalizing it is important. Can you maybe just speak a little bit more about, we talk at Baycrest about precision aging. What we want to do is to do for aging and brain health what precision medicine has done for cancer, and really making sure each person's getting what they need in the right time for them. You know, and can you speak a little bit more about that precision element, each of you?
Sure. So I'll go first. So the precision element for me started in the context of my depression work. There are even after trying multiple treatments, there are about 30% of people who don't respond to things like drug therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And there are a lot of individual differences in the way depression presents, in how old you are when you get depression, in how old you are when you're being treated. And so I felt that there has to be something in these individual differences that can be used to improve treatment success. This carries on beautifully to my aging work. So same thing. Some people age amazingly. Some people, they don't age amazingly. What your brain looks like doesn't have as much predictive value as one would think. So there are people whose brains sort of physically really don't look that good, but in terms of their behavior, they're amazing, and vice versa. So what I'm really interested in are the individual factors that can help us increase your health span, basically.
So where do you know, or how do you know where to start? I mean, if you've got 30% of people who aren't responding to medication, and you don't obviously from the beginning know what their differences are, otherwise you wouldn't be searching for them, it just sounds to me like there could be like 10,000 things.
There totally can be. I pick one to address. So what I do is look at, so I look at neurostimulation for depression in that context. And I look at sort of, so there are theories as to what parts of your brain work together and don't work together ideally when you are depressed. When we are stimulating those parts of your brain, we're basically taking kind of one stimulator focally, and we're trying to get all of those regions that work together. So if there are individual differences in the physical properties of your brain, so where exactly that part of your brain is that we're trying to stimulate, and there are differences in the way those regions are connected, and the extent to which they respond to for example, the stimulation itself, then instead of trying to kind of get at an end goal, we try to get at how can we stimulate your brain so that the most of the important regions are affected, and therefore hopefully reset as much as that is possible. So I'm telling you this in the context of depression, but you can easily transfer it in the context of aging, right? So, yeah.
Or in the context of PCOS.
Yeah, and so PCOS, even even now, we've been able, with some volunteer student assistance over the last few weeks, replicate research around clustering of the condition into 4 distinct phenotypes. And so, I've been at the conference where the researcher told us about that research, and we've used a publicly available data set to replicate that in the last few weeks. And so, talking to people living with this condition for many years, I've only met 2 individuals, to be honest, who feel like they've got their condition under control with lifestyle modifications. 2 out of more than 120. So that's 118 who are desperate for something to make their condition better, to make their health better, but can't find it. So we are very optimistic that we will soon be able to cluster people into cohorts that are even more granular than those phenotypes with real-world data, and based on their reporting, we'll be able to suggest, if you are in this phenotype, actually go gung-ho on a vegan diet. That's what's most likely to work for you based on what other people who you're cohorted with can do. So they don't have to try 6, 10, 15 different versions of a diet. We can give them an indication of this is most likely to work for you. Same with things like exercise and other activities, like what's working for people who are most like you. And so we're very optimistic that we'll be able to do that very quickly with, a few hundred data sets, not thousands.
Yeah, and that's very similar to, as you mentioned, the work that we're doing at Baycrest in the Kimmel Family Center for Brain Health and Wellness, which is focused on prevention. And it's all about taking a personalized approach to dementia prevention, which is the focus of the podcast that Jay and I do. So yes, we know there are all these different risk factors, but what we're trying to do is to come up with an individualized longevity prescription or an individualized brain health prescription. So, Jay's prescription for social engagement, cognitive engagement, sleep, etc., might and probably does look different from mine because we have different histories and different ways of approaching things. And even within, sleep, we've talked about sleep a lot on our podcast, like what works for me to be able to sleep well may not work for you or may not work for someone else.
But I was really interested in Claire's comments about seeking precision for the 118 out of 120.
Yeah.
And the issue that is, I think, slightly different with dementia is that it unfolds over a very long time. And so even if you look at diets, there's the Alzheimer's diet, the Mediterranean diet, there's a new diet I can't even remember the name of, and I would say 80% of them are the same, but one, you eat more nuts, the other eat more yams, I don't know. But it doesn't, I mean, they're all good, right? And so precision may be a bit elusive, and the issue with dementia, which I'm hoping, these kinds of people that we have on the panel are going to contribute to in various ways, might enable us to be quite sure that the lifestyle changes that we talk about on the podcast actually work. We think there's all the evidence that we possess to this date suggests they should work, and they do work, but the evidence that they work, because really we've only been talking about them seriously for 10 or maybe 15 years at most. We just don't have that kind of evidence yet. But this is why this range of research is really so important.
Yeah, and I should probably
turn on your mic.
It's on. I should probably say that one of the reasons why we think the PCOS community is so important is in this community you start to see markers of cognitive impairment.
I think if you turn it off and back on.
It's glowing.
There you go.
Okay. So I was saying one of the reasons why we're most excited about this community in particular, because you see markers of mild cognitive impairment in the PCOS community in the 30s, right? So you start to see things very early on in the lifespan that indicate that increased risk for dementia later in life.
Claire, sorry, does that mean that they're going to get early onset or young onset, or just that you see the markers early and you might expect it at the normal age?
Exactly. You see the markers early, and then you see an increased, like double the risk later. So, it does link. I believe it will also be generalizable because of the link to cardiovascular health.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, by studying this particular group, I think, it is going to be relevant for a much broader audience, and we'll be able to learn stuff that people can, I wish I was thinking more about these risks when I was younger.
Yeah.
But, we can start to tell people, you personally, like, here's your risk, and, like, that's a dynamic thing that you can adjust today, but the advice we're giving you is based on something rather than, anecdotal. It's actually based on hard science.
And
So
we do have a
I think-
10-year-old in the audience who I assume at the end of this session is going to do everything that he can to adjust his lifestyle to be as healthy as possible.
And not embarrass them at the same time. And just a note about cardiovascular involvement. We, on the podcast, tend to follow the now pretty famous Lancet Commission on Dementia, which every 3 years or so produces a new analysis of what each lifestyle factor contributes to your risk of dementia, because they do change. Fewer people smoke, so the contribution of smoking lessens. Yeah. But the other day, there's 14 of them officially recognized now, and we just added up how many have a connection to the cardiovascular system, and there was like 6 or 7.
Or 8 or 9.
Everything from LDL cholesterol to high blood pressure to diabetes to obesity, they all have an impact. So it's super important. The circulation of your blood to your brain. Brain consumes 20% of the energy you take in every day. It's no wonder that they're involved.
I think this is also a real shift in the way we do research.
Yeah.
So when I started, I don't know, probably about 25 years ago, we were trying to find that one thing that's common to everybody that's going to fix it. And then, Jay was just saying that there are how many?
Like
14 factors, and you can't do them all.
At least.
Yeah, and like if you're trying to do everything right, you're not going to succeed. So we need to figure out who needs what, and what's the most important for each person.
Yeah. But this brings us to sort of this bigger question about, we'll have people in the audience, whether they're here in person or virtually, who may be in the early stages or maybe at the later stages of their research careers and are trying to figure out, how do I go beyond publishing in Nature or Cell or Journal of Neuroscience? How do I make something out of the knowledge? And it can be paralyzing, can't it? Because there's so much that you're doing. And I wonder if you can maybe start with Claire, talk a little bit about your journey, because where you ended up is very different from where you started. How do you figure out what's the next question to ask? How do you figure out what are the right sorts of things to be looking at? Claire?
And just a reminder, Claire is an engineer and did an MBA at Harvard, so doesn't immediately suggest an interest in brain science.
Yeah, so where we started was classic brain-machine interface. Our first indication we were going for was intracranial EEG, so putting electrodes on your brain, directly on your brain, with a first application in epilepsy pre-assessment for surgery. And that was Neuro 1.0. Over the course of 5 years, we learned that invasive neurotech takes hundreds of millions of dollars and decades. It's hard, and it's a long journey. We pivoted our primary indication to the PCOS space just over 2 years ago, and with that...
So you went from epilepsy, intracranial brain stimulation, to PCOS, where you're stimulating actually here. Yeah.
External, so minimally invasive neuromod. And so still our origins in hardware, hard tech, right? We have a proprietary microelectrode that's patented, unique technology. As we came to understand the space we're in and the burden of disease, it became very clear very quickly that we can't tackle the burden of disease just by tackling the disease. And so PCOS is a prime example. There's a 70% diagnostic gap. The standard of care actually contributes to the diagnostic gap. The standard of care contributes to actually, a lot of women we talk to, they get put on the pill, they don't get diagnosed. The pill can lead to additional weight gain, messes with their fertility further, and comes with additional risks of side effects we were talking about before. The burden of disease is partly a function of the system of care today, if I was completely honest. And we realized that we needed to wrap around the treatment device a digital solution to actually tackle some of these broader issues, starting with the information gap, which, unfortunately, I'd say, in a condition like PCOS, and you look at kind of your standard healthcare structure, nobody owns it. Like, no single discipline owns it. Like, clinical care likes to cut us into little neat packages, and our bodies and our brains don't work like that. It's all connected. And so, we just recognized we had to do more. And as we've gone on that journey, it's becoming easier and easier to make a dent on the digital side of innovation. If you have a clear idea, you talk to people and really understand their needs. And so, yes, we're really excited about bringing out a new treatment, but we're equally excited about actually providing something that's a tool for people that will be fed, obviously, with their data and create insights, but will make a difference just by providing them with information that's robust and reliable and science-backed, which is hard to get today.
So in a way, you were letting the needs of the people kind of drive where you were going.
Yeah, you have to, right? You have to really understand and be drawn to where the need is.
From a researcher perspective, to what extent do you don't actually have end users in the same way, but you've got people that you're doing research about, and to what extent is that also relevant for the sort of earlier stage research?
So, it very relevant. I guess I spent a lot of my research career really focusing on the brain, trying to figure out how the brain works and how it changes as you age. And then I had some personal experiences with a parent with dementia. And I realized that, that's not going to get me anywhere. It's not going to get my parent anywhere. So I figured out firsthand how much of a difference it makes when you have lived experience with what you're studying, right? And it totally pivoted my research. You cannot compare the questions I'm asking today to the questions I was asking 5 years ago. They're completely different entities. And of course, the former stuff feeds on the current stuff, but as far as I'm concerned, you don't get to do research without including the people who you are trying to learn about in forming the questions, in telling you what's important, in telling you what they need out of the stuff that you're doing.
So the two of you sort of exist in the same kind of research space, but taking very different approaches. Can you learn from each other? And if so, how? Well, I can't just leave it at yes.
So I could, for me, it's becoming less so, but historically research was very much of an ivory tower, right? So we did our thing, we communicated our thing, and there wasn't a huge effort to communicate to the public. And there was an assumption that eventually it would be practically applicable, but we weren't responsible for that, right? Whereas now we are. And people who are in industry are coming at this from kind of my goal point. So of course we can learn from each other.
And you, and what would you draw from Andrea's experience?
Yeah, so I'm not a MD or a PhD, so I rely heavily on network of advisors, delving into the research in this space. It's one of the things that I've loved most about what I get to do in my role. I've spent hundreds of thousands of hours basically looking at the research, making sense of it in the context of the condition that we're tackling. I personally feel, I'll go back to the health equity point. When I look at a lot of the solutions that are out there today, I don't think they're necessarily doing justice to us in terms of translating what research already exists. When I look at, a lot of women's health platforms, a lot of content out there, for example, it's created by marketers who have not delved deep into the topic. And so it's very surface level. And so as a company, given our backgrounds, given our heritage, it's a core part of who we are, is to be science-based. And that's in every aspect of how we try and approach things. Now, obviously, we're aiming to have customers, and accessibility is a big component of that health equity. But that's very easy to do if you kind of start with a really strong foundation, and doing the kind of literature review and building that the ground up is what, I actually spend a fair amount of my time doing. And, I don't put anything out, content-wise, without getting somebody who's an expert in the space to carefully review it and make sure it's accurate, not misleading, and not irresponsible.
And I just want to pick up on what Andrea said with the phrase, the ivory tower. And if you dare to look at the political landscape at any level today, provincial, just leaving that out there, federal, American, there's a certain amount of anti-academia thinking, and we don't know if that'll persist or die away or whatever. But even if it dies away, I would still argue that there's lots of room for improvement from the research side to letting people like all of us know what's going on. And, I've spent many decades working at this, and I would need many more decades to get to the point where I think it's actually okay now. We're doing our part with Defy Dementia, but this is just my kind of message. It's super important to translate at many levels, even to people who have no particular interest, but they have a relative who has a condition, and now I'm hearing about research that might address that condition. So, yeah, I'm finished.
I have a question for all three of you, which is, how do you know when the science is ready to take it to that next level, whether that next level is sharing it with the public through media or podcast or whatever, or whether it's creating a new kind of technology or other kind of wraparound app? How do you know that the science is ready to share it with the world? We'll start with Jay.
So that's a more complicated question than it might sound, because if you're working in the media, I'll take it from the media point of view. When I was working at Daily Planet, we used to get a flood of press releases every day. We threw them all out because we didn't know who these people were. We didn't know how much they knew about our show. They would make suggestions about things we would never normally talk about. But we were never, when you have to add at the bottom, of course, more research is necessary, it kind of lessens the impact. But people would send us stuff saying, oh, amazing new breakthrough in something. But when you really analyzed it, you couldn't be sure. And the other thing is, in communicating to any audience, the audience comes first. Not what you want to tell the audience, but what you think they want to know. And that's a very different picture that, if I can generalize, scientists aren't used to. And to become a great science communicator, you have to forget what it is you're dying to tell people and instead say, well, why are they here? Why are they listening? Why are they reading this? Let's give them the straight goods. But to be sure, I'm sure we talked about stuff that never amounted to anything. But it's, you've got an hour show and you've got to fill it. So there's always that incumbent pressure on you.
Claire?
Yeah, I mean, in the same way that we've been intentional about advising experts, researchers, doctors, we've also been intentional about assembling an end user advisory board. And so, we reach out to them on an ongoing basis, right? Because we can't make decisions about even the simplest of things independent of our audience, right? So we have actively sought to get feedback through the development of the device. I'm very conscious. I write very, very boring, very informative articles, slightly easier to understand than academic papers, but only just. But in the last few weeks...
Is that a brag or an admission?
No, it's an apology. Humble brag. It's an apology, right? Because I'm a nerd. But in the last few weeks, one of our student volunteers has translated my writings into an interactive chatbot that you can ask whatever question you like and we'll give you an answer about PCOS. And so all of a sudden, my boring articles will probably have much more impact because it's like we're going to integrate it into the community aspect of our app. We're going to give it a personality. And so when someone asks a question of their peers, we're not going to stifle them, right? We're not going to police them, but we'll have that evidence-backed voice to say, actually, like, here it is, and here's the other sources you can go to if you want to learn more. So I think kind of it's incumbent on us to kind of push the envelope to get as much out there as we can and make it as accessible as possible.
Yeah. Andrea?
So I have a bunch of ideas going on. So going from research to translation in terms of actually putting something that we've discovered into effect. I think, one, you need to make sure that it really does what you think it's going to do. Not just in your hands, but in the hands of others. Two, you have to be able to convey what it does in a simple and logical way. And then whatever tool you create, so if, for example, we figure out exactly how to individualize neurostimulation, it has to be streamlined and it has to be useful in a clinical setting. And that's a big ask, right? And it's probably many years before we get there. Communicating about it, I think this ties back to what Jay was saying. So you have to be responsible, right? I can tell you that I'm developing this new technique, but if I know that it's not, anywhere near getting out there, or that it does work, but only if you spend a month on each patient, that's not responsible. That's not helping anybody. So I think there's a big responsibility in what you share and how you share it.
And just a quick thing, I think a little bit of information about critical thinking and what you see on the internet would serve all of us quite well. And if you see anything as you're, going through your social media, it says, this doctor says, you can immediately dump that and go on to something else. And it's just, I've become so attuned to it that I can sort of tell what's spam and what isn't. But it's ubiquitous, and people are going to be constantly misled. So I'm not saying I put all the weight on people that are doing the research and making recommendations. We all have a little bit of a responsibility to try and screen what's BS from what isn't.
Yeah, I do want to, I don't know if it's pushed back a little bit, but maybe it is. Just, I do a lot of advising for companies informally through CABHI, obviously, but also through the Creative Destruction Lab, and I've advised through Corrales, which is formerly known as SheEO, and other groups. And it drives me a little off the wall when I see some of the companies come forward, and they're literally raising millions and millions of dollars based on vapor. Like, there's nothing there, but they have a really strong way of presenting things. They have that confidence going into the boardroom where they know the right people. And then I see scientists who have been toiling over some issue for decades, and the evidence is there, it's stacked up, but they don't have that confidence, and they could be doing more for society with the work that they've got. But there's this sense among some scientists, and again, I'm generalizing, but that, until it's really done, then I can start turning it into something. And I think there has to be some kind of happy medium, right? So, you can't wait until it's done, because then you've lost the opportunity, and you won't have had an opportunity to share the knowledge in a way with people. But if you go too early, and it's just, the vapor, how do you, I just want to encourage the people who are scientists here to think a little bit more that you don't have to wait until you have the definitive answer, because in science you never have the definitive answer. So you just have to think about, when do I have enough that I am convinced this can make a difference? If you know it's not going to work, don't sell it. But if you have enough evidence that this could make a difference in someone's life, I will continue the research while I'm starting the company, and you learn from that. When you were working on what you're working on, was everything worked out before you started raising any money? Maybe the answer is yes. I don't know.
Corporate secret's coming.
With Neurora 1.0, it was a lot easier to raise money when we weren't in women's health. No comment. We raised money to do a live animal study that we had to do to prove the technology was superior to the clinical gold standard. And so we were able to raise money before that study to do it.
Right, but you didn't have the evidence before you... Right.
We had evidence, but it was not equivalent to the clinical setting, whereas once we went into obviously the live study, it was. In the space we're in currently, we're translating research that's been done over the last 30 years by the global thought leader in this condition. It's still hard to raise money.
Yeah, but you're also still learning things as you're going, right?
Yeah, I would say one of the things kind of I would encourage if you are working on research is exactly if it's going to be going through the clinical pathway. One of the biggest things we learned was, unfortunately, if every stakeholder is not better off, often financially, across the value chain, somebody will block it. And so it doesn't matter how revolutionary, how much better it could be in terms of the impact on people's lives. You have to figure out how to integrate it with the clinical system where every single stakeholder is better off. If somebody's worse off, it's not gonna ever get to market. And so it's a very sad state of affairs, but that's just the reality. And so part of the great thing about working, we're going over the counter just to avoid that, because we know there's a huge demand of people who have this condition, and we can, because it's not invasive. So that was part of our
anytime
story.
you have to integrate with a hospital setting, it just loads of hurdles, right? But you can get past them. I think we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. Do you have something you want to add?
So in terms of what to share, I think we also need to listen to people with lived experience, right? So I can have thoughts about when I think this is ready for airtime, but I'm not the expert on that.
Okay.
All right. This is your opportunity to ask the dying questions that I know you have of our panel. Questions in the audience, and I will work my legs out, build my brain health to make sure you get this microphone. Come on. Do you want to see me run upstairs? Maybe?
Well, maybe while we're waiting for people to get the courage.
Okay, you're just giving me like not a non-workout.
In terms of where the science canon should be going, where innovation canon should be going, I mean, totally agree. We need to be asking people with lived experience, but we all have some lived experience. You've been a caregiver and so on. So what do you think are the emerging trends or most important issues in aging and brain health that, you know, if there is someone out there who doesn't know what it is that they want to be researching or creating or innovating, what advice would you have for people? What's coming? Put on your futurist hat and say what's coming up.
Well, it's very topical, but there was a New York Times article yesterday on the role of hormones in brain health. So I feel like we've just really started to peel back the envelope on that one, and I'm really excited about where that's going to go.
So I think there's a lot to be said for looking at things from multiple scales. So really going from kind of individual neurons to the society that we live in and everything in between. And I don't think we're going to get answers unless we we're able to put all of that information to one framework. So I think that's where I would tell people to go.
And I would add a plea for anyone in the audience who, you know, is interested in continuing research along these lines, to remember that it would be best if, as you were pursuing the research, you were figuring out how's the most effective way to communicate this. Because in the end, you're not going to be talking just to your peers. And, you know, the paper or the poster session you do at a convention is not talking, I was almost going to say to real people, but that isn't quite what I wanted to say. But it's not communicating at a level where corporate venture capitalists are, I mean, you know, they're sophisticated, but they want to hear it in a well-communicated form. And I know this is a big ask because scientists have, you know, if they're academics, teaching responsibilities, administrative, you know, paperwork, grant requests, and so on. And so it's asking a lot to say you should devote some additional time to being a good communicator to people that you're not meeting at conventions. But I think in the end, that's an important thing.
And I think when you're putting those presentations together, you have to remember who is your audience. So if you are putting together like a deck for a venture fund, it's going to look different than it would if you're on one of Jay's shows, right?
I learned something recently from talking to a couple of young guys who graduated engineering here at U of C and are now working on tech projects in Victoria. And they send out a package, a slide package, and the people who receive it, the potential funders, spend an average of like 80 seconds on it. And that requires good design.
Yeah. In terms of with my futurist hat on, where I get most excited is in thinking about the convergence of technologies or collision of technologies. So yes, there's brain stimulation, and yes, there's various new sorts of drugs, or there's AR, VR, XR, or there's robotics. But where I get excited is when you start to think about how does it all fit together, and what kind of platforms can there be to sort of take, instead of this person's company has a good idea and this one has a good idea, but if you put them together, it's like how you form a Reese's peanut butter cup, right? This one's got the chocolate, and this one's got the peanut butter, and you put them together, and now, ooh, I want to eat that company. You know, I mean, so that convergence of technologies, instead of addressing each problem individually, if we start thinking about them, it's almost like the multi-scale, but it's across problems almost. I
So
think
that's something you like. Something I don't like is people like Elon Musk saying, oh, Neuralink, his brain implant device, will one day, soon, allow us to connect directly to AI, and then our brains are going to process information at a rate that has never happened in human evolution. And he's right, it'll never happen in human evolution, just because our brains are attuned to processing information at a speed that our senses provided. There was a wonderful paper published out of Caltech 2 months ago showing that the speed of internal mental processing in humans is like many multiples of 10 less than what you'd be getting from an AI through a neural implant. So it's just actually nonsense. Neural implants can do amazing things for people who have lost the ability to speak for one reason or another. But one should always be cautious about the tech bros who are saying this is what life's going to be like in 2050.
Now
And
do
I'm
peop-
not biased.
But now do people have questions? Thoughts?
Yes. all
Comments?
right.
Yes.
They wanted to see you run, Roseanne, but.
Good afternoon, and firstly, thank you for this amazing conversation. I work in the innovation space here in Calgary. I've worked across all the sectors, so healthcare, energy, construction, agriculture, everything that we have. And one of the things that strikes me is that, you know, we get very fixated on the technology and the innovation of things when we maybe need to be thinking about the innovation of ways. And especially in healthcare, when we start to think about moving from a system of sick care to well
Yes.
care. So I would really love your thoughts on you know, right now we have a healthcare system across the country in crisis. Here in Alberta, we are transforming our system, but it's still in flux. And the conversation that you've provided us today is such an important conversation, because if we can get ahead of this, the implications of this are massive, not only for our economy, but you know, for our whole population health, starting from the child all the way up. So, you know, I'd really just love the thoughts on how do we get in front of this, and do we have the right people in the room?
Yeah.
Meaning, this is the city of head office capitals in Canada, in many sectors, and I don't think we have any of them in the room. So my question is always, do we have the right people in the room? And then are we driving the right conversation around, do we focus on technology, or do we actually focus on ways and innovation of the change management that is going to be needed for our system right now?
Yeah, and Andrea, you sort of alluded to that when you were talking about need to have ways of having it adopted. I don't know if you want to start. You don't have to, if you don't want to, but I can.
Let me think about that a little bit.
I mean, so in Ontario, we think about this quite a lot. So I co-chair the Ontario Hospital Association Research and Innovation Committee, and we're just starting a new task force on innovation for healthcare that's really moving in this direction. And there was a recent report that just came out talking about what the state of healthcare needs was going to look like in 2040. I don't know if you've seen it yet. I can share it with you after if you haven't. But it's whatever issues we face now, just because of the way that the population is aging, and other issues are coming in around obesity and other issues. If we don't get ahead of it now, we're screwed, frankly. And in the context of aging and brain health, we also need to get ahead of it because people don't want to go into long-term care homes, right? And Baycrest runs one of the largest long-term care homes in the country. Our Apotex has about 500 beds. And I always say, like, our job is to put that part of Baycrest out of business. Like, our job is to do whatever we can so that people can age at home as well as possible. Our job is to do whatever we can so that we can make sure nobody ends up with dementia if it is avoidable, right? But that's not how we're set up, exactly how you phrased it. We don't have a healthcare system. We do have a sick care system. So one of the things I think that I took away from some of the comments here was that we need to make sure that we are taking advantage of the accidents and capitalizing on them, and not sort of saying, okay, we know this is the way we've always done it, so we will just keep doing it this way. We need to say, okay, well, here was a pandemic, and during the pandemic, what happened? There was a lot more virtual care. There was a lot more saying, okay, well, people are going to be staying out in the communities, and we'll find a way of getting the medical care to them and personalizing things more, and so on and so forth. And then pandemic, it's not actually over, but you know, the peak of the hysteria, whatever, ended. And then certainly in Ontario, a lot of the opportunities to be doing that virtual care disappeared. Like, why did we not say, here's our opportunity to pivot everything and say, this is working? And yeah, we were forced down this road, but we should have just kept accelerating there. And I think that's part of it is in healthcare. I've worked in a number of different fields. In healthcare, I find the legal concerns are always so strong. You know, well, if I do this, if I use AI for diagnosis, well, I could get sued. So even though it might be better in this case, do I really want to adopt that? Or yes, if I have a new innovation that's going to help, you know, in the long term, it'll save every nurse on the floor 20 minutes when they're dealing with each patient. But to get there, I've got to invest some more money, or I've got to do some training. It's not worth it. So I think that part of what it is really, to your point, yes, we do have to make sure that the heads of the CEOs of companies are here, but we have to make sure that the healthcare workers are really brought into the conversation, and that that's what CABHI is trying to do, is to create a community of innovation so that people understand, here's why we need to adopt these new kinds of solutions. I don't have the answer to how we get there, but if we don't seriously change the way that we address health, we're in trouble, serious trouble. And there was actually just a study that came out that suggested, in terms of, although Canada, I think, spends the second most per person in terms of healthcare of the OECD countries, we are, is it second last? We're now the second last in terms of wait times and so on. So there's a disconnect there, right? So I don't know. Anyone want to solve the problem that? No?
Looks like Andrea would like to talk.
Well, so I mean, so when you said I was talking about streamlining things, so for me that was a streamlining of a thing, right? Not a way. But when you were asking about kind of ways of doing things, I think there's a lot to be said for example, learning from other societies who do something better and figuring out ways of implementing it locally. And I think it really ties into not treating people who are already sick, but really getting ahead of that.
Yeah. And we are seeing some of that. I mean, so for example, in the clinical trials field, if you look at what happened during COVID in the United Kingdom, they were able to do a lot more work very, very quickly because they had already set up a system where no matter what part of the UK you lived in, you could share your data across different areas. Here, if I collect data in Ontario, I can't share it with Alberta, right? Health data, right? And say, you know, So we can't do the same kind of big trials because there's all these little provincial rules. And I think actually what's interesting, you mentioned our neighbors to the south. One of the things that we're starting to see is, okay, even trading within Canada is hard, but maybe this particular point in time is going to open that up a little bit more and do it faster than it would have if we didn't have the crisis going on right now. And so my hope would be, and we're seeing a little bit of this in the clinical trials data, there is a move to be able to do more of that sharing, right? And so I'm sort of hopeful that Canada will rise to the occasion here and see this challenge for what it is, which is potentially a huge opportunity for us. If we start thinking like we are a country, we should all be working together instead of, even within Ontario, Toronto doing things differently than Hamilton doing things differently from Ottawa. I mean, if we work together, I think there's huge amount of brain power in Canada, and this is our opportunity to if we have the guts to take advantage of that situation, I think we can really move things forward. Vote for me for Prime Minister.
Other questions for our panel?
Just to comment on that, there's a lot of talk during the federal campaign about breaking down interprovincial trade barriers. But I don't recall anyone putting that in the context of sharing health information, which is a reflection of the lack of discussion about healthcare in this campaign. Now, it's a provincial responsibility, so federal leaders may want to stay away from it, but what you just said, I think, is super important. And, the next question is, well, how difficult would this be? And if it's not that difficult, it'd be a great thing to start, a great way to start.
Yeah. I think we can collaborate on an op-ed or something a little bit later. So if there's no more questions from the audience, any last chance for questions from the audience? But we need to, I think, wrap it up. And I'd like to maybe have each person sort of say, what advice would you give to someone who's just starting their career off in the aging and brain health sector? What's your best advice?
I can start on this one. We actually were talking about this before we came. So believe in yourself. And this is a lot more profound than it sounds. Allison was talking about, watching the RuPaul show and how confidence sells it. And you need that to succeed.
Believe in yourself, okay?
Yeah.
Just find something that you really care about. Whether it's dedicating your career in research, or whether it's entrepreneurship, or whether it's working in healthcare, whatever that looks like, or, working as a perpetual student of healthcare situation. It's a tough road, right? I've spent my career looking for harder and harder problems, and I think I found it, right? So you've really got to have that fire in your belly and lean into that. It's got to mean something to you. Don't chase accolades, don't chase dollars, whatever. Really feel it in your gut that this is the place where you can lean into.
I would say, I'll say something and you can finish.
You talk.
My advice is to take risks. If you just keep doing things the same way, you're not going to get anywhere. You have to take risks. You have to be willing to fail and recognize that we're failing in a safe community. And that's how we can advance, is by taking the risk. It's not always going to work. 80%, 90% of the time it's not going to work. But just don't be afraid to try, and don't be afraid to fail. And eventually you will get there.
I agree with all three people up here. But I would add, it's easy to say, some people say, follow your passion. I know you were making it a little bit more fine. You were making a finer distinction than that. But it's not always easy to do that, because your passion might be, growing grapes in Alberta or something. But it is an essential piece, I think, because inevitably in any career, there's going to be ups and downs. And if during the downs, you're still convinced that what you're doing is worthwhile and important to you, that gets you through those little depths a little more easily than, if you don't have that faith. For some weird reason, and this is really my point, is that you don't always know where that's going to come from. I started a PhD at McMaster, and I'd already decided this isn't what I wanted to do. I just didn't know where I was going to go. I wanted to communicate science to general audiences. There was nobody doing that when I was thinking that, but I was so sure. I quit my PhD and lucked out in a series of ways, which I won't bother you with. But if I hadn't had that, I might have just, who knows? I shudder to think of what I would have ended up doing. So you do have to have the feeling, but the feeling may come from some direction you're not even expecting. So you got to be alert too, right? Be ready to take risks, have confidence, but also just be open-minded about what is going through your mind and why are you spending so much doing that when it's not really your work? Because maybe that's the thing you should be doing. I know that wasn't helpful. Sorry.
That was helpful.
Well, it's too indistinct. Never mind.
You need to have more confidence in what you're saying. And
I can actually, all right, if you're allowing me to talk, I can pinpoint the very time when I realized this is what I wanted to do. I was doing my master's at University of Toronto. I had access to an electron microscope, which was super fantastic. And there was a weekend when parents came to see what the university was doing to their kids. And so I had a bunch of people standing around the electron microscope, and I was going to show them the bacteria that I was working with that were so incredibly fascinating to me, and only me. And in those days, you put a sample on a tiny copper disc that had a mesh on it. So I showed them the copper disc, I put the bacteria on it, pumped down the vacuum. And the image you see is where the mesh, which was barely visible, is like big, broad lines like that. And people in the audience gasped. And I thought, like they are fascinated not by the specimens on this thing, just by the incredible magnification of it. And they had no idea what an electron microscope did. And that was the time I said, look, if I can freak somebody out with an electron microscope, there's a whole world of science out there that I can do that with. There you go.
I think that's a good note for us to wrap up.
Well,
freak people out. That's your last bit of advice.
Well, first of all, I've got to acknowledge some people that made this possible, besides Claire and Andrea, and I'm trying to find the crew, the total crew that did this. It's somewhere in my papers here. Never mind. I'll find it eventually. Sorry. Stephen Dolman of the Calgary Public Library. I want to acknowledge him. I had a page with these acknowledgements, which I don't have anymore. Sorry. Do you have one?
Well, or why don't we just ad-lib it and just say Stephen from
the library.
Dr. Jana
Holder
Duke from the University of Calgary.
We have all of the Defy
team.
Dementia crew who are here, especially those people, well, especially Roseanne over here. But there are people manning desks at the top where you can interact with exhibits. You can try a bunch of things and qualify for a raffle. There are refreshments up top. So really, why are you sitting here? You should be going up there. But there are also some names that I'm neglecting because I don't have the list.
Yes.
And I apologize for that. I could mention a couple of the people that work on the podcast with us, because it's very important to know that not only Allison and I are speaking, but we have a producer, Ben Schaub, Roseanne works on the podcast, Sylvain de Broca works on the podcast, and we have people who do ancillary things, providing graphic art and videos on the Defy Dementia website. So a podcast is not a simple thing, and it's not an easy thing to produce, but when you've got talented people at every level, as we have, they deserve acknowledgement.
And we want to also say thank you to all of you for spending your time here with us. And please do take advantage of the refreshments upstairs. Check out all of the booths, see all the really interesting things going on from the companies and the organizations. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.